Now we start off Tzadi Gimel. Boy minei Rami bar Chama mirav Chizda. Nitaz al beged tome mahu. This is a complicated sugi. We're going to try to do the best we can. What happens if the beged that received the spattering of the dam was itself tome? Do we require kibbutz in such a case? Because what happens is that the dam, the moment it reaches the garment, becomes tome, because it has a maga with a clear garment that's tame. And once the dam is tame, then it's not roy lizrika, and therefore it's not mechayev kibus. Omar of Huna bereid Rabbi Yeshua, mida kami boile hachi, shmamina hoisel shasa goshim nifsla ein damaton kibus. You're assuming, like the Chachamim of Rabbi Akiva, that even in a case where the dam at one point in time was valid and royal kibus, if it later on becomes possible, then that dam does not generate a chi of kibus. This, despite the fact that it had a shas hakosher. At one point in time, it was valid for hazoya. But what is your suffix? Hani mili bozecher zeh, aval vasachas lo odum lo shna. Do we say that if it's a two-stage process, at time T1, the dam was kosher, and then later on, at time T2, it became possible. And since it became possible, it doesn't generate a chi of kibus. Aval b'vasachas lo, but if it became possible simultaneous with the emergence of the chi of kibus, namely at the moment that it hit the garment, it was absorbed by the garment, then in that case, since it was simultaneous and it's not in a two-stage process, therefore, we don't care about the fact that it became tamei once it was absorbed, because at that moment that it was absorbed, it was in a state of tara. In other words, it only transferred from tumah v'tara when it hit the beged. So when it hit the beged, in a sense, we can view it as if it was dam haroy lizrika, it wasn't tamei. Or should we say it doesn't matter? Even if the dam becomes posel lizrika, simultaneous with its reaching and being absorbed by the garment, nevertheless, there's no chi of kibus. Amalei plugta de Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanon, aliba de Rabba, ukid komentaris Abaye. Your suffix depends upon a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanon, the way Rabba interpreted, and the way Abaye interpreted Rabba's interpretation of that machlokas. Rabba is the Rebbe of Abaye, and Abaye tries to interpret his Rebbe's pshat in the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbanon. Desanya, we learned in a brisa. Now this brisa addresses the issue of mei chatos. Mei chatos are the waters that are prepared by a concoction of the sreifas paraduma, the ashes of the paraduma, in mayim chayim, and then you put an azov in, and you use that to sprinkle it on the tamei mes. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Elazar Omer, mei chatos shenitmu, even though it became tamei, the mei chatos, nevertheless mitarin. Because when it comes to paraduma, we don't use logic. And according to Rabbi Loza, this is the mechanism by which it works. I don't care one iota about the fact that the mei chatas are tamei. Still, it can be used to generate tara through the sprinkling of this dam on the tamei mes. How does Rabbi Loza know such a thing? Sharei nida mazin aleha. Oh, now a woman who's a nida, and at the same time she's also tmea tumas mes because she contracted corpse tuma. She needs only one tvila for both. So she'll have the azoya of the mechatos, then she'll go into the mikvah, obviously after the days of Tumah have passed, and that process of tvila will accomplish two goals. It'll remove Tumas Nida, and at the same time remove Tumas Mes, and she doesn't need a separate tvila. So now the question is the following. When that mechatos hits the airspace of the Nida, if we assume that the airspace of the Nida is enough to be metame, then it turns out the mechatos were tame even before they reach the body of the Nida. And yet she's tahora through the hazoya of the mechatos together with obviously the tefillah. V'yomar Rabba, Rabbi Eliezer, v'shitas Rabbi Akiva, Rabbo Amora. To Omar, what was the sheet of Rabbi Akiva? Kli al gabi mokom tome kimunach dame. Okay, this is the complicated part of the sugya. So I suggest that we first read Rabbi Akiva inside in the original Mishnah, which is a Mishnah in Paraduma, and then we'll come back to explain what Havaras Kli al gabi mokom tome means. Tisnan. So here's the situation. You've got a man standing here, you have a tanur, an oven here, and you have on this wall to which the tanur is attached, you have a window. Now in the tanur, there's a sheretz. In the avir hatanur. In the window, you have lugin, which is the liquid contained in a volume of liquid contained in a utensil. And which liquid is in the utensil? It is mechatas. Now the man is standing outside the tanur. He's going to take the mechatas through the tanur because the tanur separates the window where the mechatas is from himself. So he's mavir derech avir of tuma. Haya omed chutz letanur, sheretz b'tanur, and sheretz is metame through avir. Hoshid yodel lechalon, he stretches his hand to the window. V'notalas halogim. Logim is another word for mechatos in this context. Hevir al pi hatanur. So the tanur opens up towards the top, not like our tanurim that open up from the side, and he brings the mechatos over the tanur. So it's on the airspace of the tanur. The tanur is tame because of the sheretz. Rabbi Akiva mitame v'chachomim mitarim. So the chachomim seem to assume that the airspace above the tanur is not mitame, so that the mechatos did not contract tuma when they were brought over the tanur. Baha pligi. Rabbi Akiva savar kimunach domi. Rabbi Akiva holds that the airspace above the tanur has the same status as the tanur itself, and that's called kimunach domi. It's as if the mechatos had landed on the bottom of the tanur, and therefore it is tome. Rabbanan savri lav kimunach domi. The Rabbanan hold that even though you're taking it over the airspace of the tanur, and the tanur has a sheretz in it, nevertheless, it's not as if the mechatos were on the bottom of the oven. But Esvei Abaye says, I can't explain the machlokus the way Rabbah did if I take it kipshuta. Why? Because we have another brisa that states that Moda Rabbi Akiva be'hazah shehavira al kli cheres tameh. So havira means he took the mechatos inside a kli over a kli cheres, and that kli cheres is tameh. Is Rabbi Akiva holds that the mechatos is tameh. Al gabi mishkav u'moshav tameh. But if the mishkav u'moshav was tameh, let's say a zav sat on this bed, shehi tahora. Why? Because a mishkav u'moshav is only mitami b'maga, and there was no contact between the mechatos and the mishkav ha'zav. She'en l'cha dover shemitame lemala kilamata. El kizayis min hames. So now we're talking about an ohel, and the specific unique halacha of mess in an ohel is that the airspace of the ohel is tameh. V'shar kol ha'mahilim. What is ushar kol ha'mahilim? Lasuye even hamenugas. So if you have a house that was determined to be tameh, which is called nigei batim, and you take one of the stones from the house, the bayis hamenuga, and you put it right inside an ohel, then anything that is in the airspace of that ohel becomes tameh. So we see clearly that in the case of Mishkav Moshe, Rabbi Akiva concedes that the mechatos, even though it passed over a tameh object like a Mishkav Moshe, nevertheless it doesn't contract tumah. I'm just not sure about the case of a kli cheres. 1 second, let me just see if he adds anything. I don't know. Okay, so now Abaye is forced to reinterpret Rabbah's interpretation of the Machlokes Shin, Rabbi Lozer, and the Chachamim. Ela Omar Abaye, and we'll soon see that Rava takes it a different way, but Abaye says the Kuliyam Alav Kemunach Dami, even Rabbi Akiva agrees that the fact that you passed the mechatas over the air of tumah, like in the case of the tanur, it's not as if the mechatas are resting down below on the bottom of the tanur. But rather, what Rabbah had in mind, says Abai, is a different interpretation of the machlokas, with regard to taking that lugim, a jar full of mechatas, and it passed over the tanur that was uh, contaminated by a sheretz. They, meaning both Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, got involved in a machlokes about the gzera. In other words, even though it's over the airspace and it's not doesn't contract tumor, but should we make a gzera that if we not metame it over the airspace, then he might come to think that even if it falls down to the ground, it would be tahar. So therefore, gazrinon shema yanuach, we're afraid that this jar containing mechatos might eventually land on the ground of the tanur, and he'll come and say, no, it's still tough. Rabbanan savri lo gazrin. Rabbanan never accepted such a gzera. Umod Rabbi Akiva ba'zoya. Kevan de nofak, nofak. In other words, you have the Kohen who sprinkles the mechatas onto the nida. We're not afraid that he's going to somehow, acrobatically, catch the dam midair, the mechatas midair, and then place it on the goof of the nida. So if the airspace above the nida is not considered kimunach, then there's no reason, and even Rabbi Akiva, who has such a gzera that it's shema yanuach, would not, in the case of Hazoyas Adam, he would not implement this gzera, because once the man throws the dam, it's out of his hand. He's not going to take it and put it down on the nida. For Rabbi Elazar, for Rabbanan, b'mai kamif. So now we have to go back to the drawing board and use Rabbah's explanation for the machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbanan. Rabbi b'donin tuma keduma mituma sheba osa shah kamifligi. So there's something called Tuma B'osa Shah, and then there's something called Tuma Keduma. Tuma B'osa Shah means that it was Tameh, the Mechatos was Tameh before it was sprinkled on the Tameh mess. That's called Tuma Keduma. And Tuma B'osa Shah means that the Mechatos only became Tameh at the split second that it reached the body of the Tameh. So simultaneously, the Mechatos were Mitaher and were Mitame, and became Tameh, were Nitma. Sorry. Try again. Okay. Mar Sovar, according to Rabbi Lazar, Donim. Rabbi Lazar is going to say that even if the Mechatos contracted Tumah, you could still use it to be Mazeh on the Tomei Mes and be Mitayr the Tomei Mes, because we could derive Tuma Keduma from Tuma Vasachas. And in the case of the Nida, we saw that in Tuma Vasachas, the Mechatos is Mitayr the Nida, because the Mechatos only becomes Tomei when it hits the body of the nida, simultaneously being matayer. And from that, we could derive the conclusion about Tuma Keduma in the case where the Mechatos contracted Tuma before the Hazoya. Marsavar Ein Donin. But the Chachamim rejected Rabbi Los because they say it's two separate things. In the case of the Mechatos, that became Tame simultaneously with its reaching the body of the Tame. That's where we're tired, and that's the case of Nida. But in the case where there was Tuma Keduma, the Tuma Keduma, the original Tuma, which preempted the Hazoya, cannot allow and validate the Mechatos for Tahara. However, Rava wants to suggest a different shot in the Machlokas. The Kuliyama ain't done it. Even Rebbe Loza would have to agree that you can't derive conclusions about Tuma Keduma from Tum Vasachas. They're not analogous. But what is the subject of the Machal? The Rebbe Loza Sovar Hazot Tzricha Shiur. Hazot Tzricha Shiur means that the Hazot could be done piecemeal with smaller amounts of Mechatos, and then we integrate all the different Hazoyos to make up the shear, the minimal amount of mayim of hazah, or mitzdarfin hazah. Okay. For Rabbanan Savri, hazah ain't a tzricha shear. So 1 second. So how does this help us? Rabbi Lazar argues, again, in the case of Nida, one tvila is enough, and the hazaya of the mechatos is fine. Okay. And why is this so? Because according to Rabbi Lazar, the first drops of the mechatos that reach the body of the nida will begin the process of tahara even though until it accumulates after the second, third, or whatever fourth hazoya, it was tame. Why? Because it reached the body of the nida. So you can't say that simultaneous it was matayer, because it's not matayer until he gets the subsequent cumulative hazoyos. And nevertheless, she becomes tahora from tumas mes through these piecemeal hazoyos, even though the first drops of the beginning of the hazoyos were mechatas tome, and therefore Rabbi Loza derives the conclusion that mechatas, even if it's tome, could be matayer. However, according to the Rabbanon, the first drop of mechatas, because there's no shear in a minimum requirement of how much mayim there has to be, when it falls on the nida, at that point, it generates tara. He has a whole note here about this machlokas, about whether the sprinkling of mechatas requires a minimum or does not. Okay, that's a sugya in Masechta Para. So it comes out according to Rav as opposed to Abaye. Kuliyalma lo pligi, everyone agrees that there's a fundamental distinction between simultaneous tuma and prior tuma. So if we go back, therefore, to Rami Bar Choma's case of chatos, dam chatos that splattered on a garment that was tamei, then we would say that according to everyone, the garment needs kibus. Why? Because it's a case of simultaneous tumah. That's according to Rava. But even according to Abaye, that Rabbi Lazar considers simultaneous tumah as prior tumah, the halacha should still follow the Rabbanan of Rabbi Lazar, and therefore the garment should require kibus. And this is a problem because the Rambam paskins that there's no requirement of kibus of dam chatos in a garment that's tummy. Whole discussion about the Rambam. Okay, the Mishnah says a chatos psula, right? If you have a chatos that already became posel, so the dam is not royal lizrika. If that dam sprinkles onto a beggar, you don't require kibus. Taner Rabbanon mi dama. So this is a mute, okay, and it's in the parsha in Vayikra Vav. Midam ksheira v'lo midam psula. So the brisa goes according to the Rabbanon right now that the dam does not need kibus because it was already possible. Rabbi Akiva says it depends. There's no absolute statement that you don't require kibus from dam that became possible. It all depends on whether it had a shasa kosher. If it had a shasa kosher, and at one point in time it was royal zrika, then you need kibus even if it became possible before it hit the garment. But lo isol shasa kosher, Rabbi Akiva argues that only in a case where it never had a valid moment of time where it was royal zrika, v'nifsala, is ein domaton kivus. Reb Shimon Omer echad ze v'echad ze ein domaton kivus. It doesn't matter. Even if it has shasa kosher, it doesn't matter. Now it's tame. Now it gets sprinkled onto a beggar. It doesn't require kivus. My time of the Reb Shimon, ksiv osa, and we're going to dash in the word osa in Vayikra Vav. Uksiv mi dama. Also in Vayikra Vav, a few psukim earlier, is also mute. Chad, one case comes to exclude lehecha doisel shasa kosher, and the other one comes to exclude the case of lo isel shasa kosher. For Rabbi Akiva, what does Rabbi Akiva do with the pasuk mi dama? Osa. I'm sorry. What does Rabbi Akiva do with the pasuk osa? Osa prat l'truma. Notice all these requirements of kibus do not apply to a kli that was used for truma. If now we want to use it for chulin. Rabbi Shimon l'tamei, diyomer kodshim kalam ein tu'unim mariku shtifa kol shkein truma. So Rabbi Shimon rejects the whole concept of, purging and rinsing the kli if it's kodshim kalam. Now truma, in the hierarchy, you have kodshim kalam, and then truma is below. It's what's called kedushas gvulin. It's not, kodesh of kedushas guf. It's not a korban, and certainly, therefore, the vessel does not require this purging and rinsing. Now the Mishnah says nitan minat savar ala beged. So the blood splattered from the neck of the chatas onto a garment. Eno ton kibus. Why? Because since it wasn't received in a klishares, so it was never royal zrika. It went directly from the savor of the behema onto a beggar. But minakeren. Now he was makabel the dam in a klishares, but he already fulfilled the mitzvah of zrika of hazoya, and after he put it onto the chronos of the mizbeach, we'll see which chronos, then it splattered onto a beged, no requirement of kibbutz, because it already fulfilled its mitzvah. So that this whole requirement of kibbutz only applies in that middle time period after Kabbalah B'Kli Shares, but before the actual Zrika on the Mizbeach, Umina Yisod. Now, this is very problematic when it says Mina Yisod, because Yisod, we're talking about Shvichas Shirayim. So it sounds like after he did the Shvichas Shirayim, some of the blood spilled onto a garment. It doesn't require kibbutz. The implication is before it got to the Shirayim, before it got to the Yisod, if it splattered, it would require kibbutz. That's not so, because it's already been applied to the Chronos HaMizbeach. Nishbach ala ritzba vasofo ein ton kibbutz. What happened? It went from the neck of the animal down to the ritzba, and he gathers it together. It's ein ton kibbutz, because he can't do zrika with that dam that never reached the klishares and went from the neck of the animal down to the ritzva sazara, and therefore ein ton kibbutz al adam shenis kabel b'kli v'roy l'hazar. So the Gemara immediately brings a brisa, Ton Rabbanon, Yochol nitas min tzavor ala beged yeton kibbutz. You might think that if it went from the tzavor, since in the future it would have been roy l'zrika, but it went on to the beged, and you might need kibbutz. Tamalom asher yazeh lo amarti l'chol b'roy lazah. So if it went from the tzavor onto the beged, that's the same as if it went from the tzavor down to the ritzpas. No, just 1 second. Let me get this straight. Right. It went from the neck of the animal straight into the beged, and now it's no longer royal azah, and therefore it doesn't generate a chiyuv kibbutz. Tanya Iduk had another brayse, yochol nitas min hakeren u min yesod yeiton kibbutz. Talmud lomer shayaze prat lozeh shekvar huza. Asher yaze in the future, but not to this, was already applied to the Chronos HaMizbeach. Nishbach al haritzpah. Okay, we have to finish up here, but we'll try to fit in another few minutes here on Daf Tzadi Gimel and Beis. Hasulamali. I mean, the Gemara is asking, the Mishnah doesn't add anything. It just sort of summarizes everything we know. Ma tam kamer. So it says that the Mishnah is only clarifying what the reason is. Ma tam nishbach ala ritzpa v'asof ein ton kibbutz. L'fish ein ton kibbutz el adam shenis kabel b'kli v'royal azoya. Royal azoya lemute mai. Why did the Mishnah have to add royal azoya? It's coming to exclude what case? Lemuute kibel pachos mikdei azoya b'kli zeh, pachos mikdei azoya b'kli zeh. So there's certain cases in which you can add together cumulatively different parts and put them all into one kli, but not in the case of dam hazah. Dam hazah, you need to be makabel kidei hazah in one kli. The Sanya we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Chalafta bar Shol Omer Kidesh Pachos Mi Kidei Hazah Bekli Zeh Pachos Mikdei Zeh Lo Kidesh. You cannot affect a kiddush if each separate kli received less than Kidei Hazah, because he has to do Hazah on 4 corners of the mizbech, so he needs a certain minimum amount. Iboilahu B'dam Mahu. So now we shift over to a discussion about the chatas hapnimis. Hilchasahi, which means halach l'moshe Sinai. So is this requirement that all the dam has to be sanctified simultaneously at one moment by receiving in one kli all that you need for hazoya? Is it halach l'moshe Sinai v'chusalo gamrina? The law is that when you have halacha Moshe Sinai, you only apply it in that specific case. You cannot expound it to apply it elsewhere. Oh, Dilma Hasa my timer. Or should we say, what's the reason why you need a kiddush of all at one time? So with regard to the Chatas HaPnimis, it also says v'tavel b'dam. Is Tashma, the Gemara says, the Amar Rabbi Zerika, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Af b'dam lo kidesh. Even in the case of dam of the Chatas HaPnimis, he cannot effectuate a kiddush if he accepts it piecemeal in different kalim, each one less than the amount that he needs for the hazoyah. Amar Rava Tanya, and in fact, that which you derive from Rabbi Zrika, who's an Amora, is written explicitly in a price of Tanoim, V'toval v'lo mesape, Badom anshei adam shir tefila meikaro, and min adam sheba inyan. So we have two psukim here. We have one pasuk v'toval, which means that the Kohen dips his finger into the blood, but he doesn't wipe it in the blood. And Badam teaches me, Ad shehei Badam shir tefila meikaro. So now the question is, why do we need both? Badam. It would not be enough to just say Badam. I'm sorry, it would not be enough to just say V'toval, to ikos Rachmana V'toval, Havamina afal pi deleka shir tefila meikaro. Right? It means that now V'tovel, at this moment, he gathers together accumulatively from the different kalim, and it's roy le zrika. Is therefore covered badam, and the word badam is telling me that the entire amount has to be received in a klisharis simultaneously in one klisharis, the entire amount. Because Rahman badam havamina filu misapek. Even if he wipes the kli with his forefinger in order to obtain the blood, his kasra Rahman v'taval, he has to dip his finger into the blood. Min adam shebe'inyi lemute mai, and then the pasuk says min adam, from the blood, and the Brisa took a derivation to say that it's from the blood in this particular pasuk. What is it coming to exclude? The remnants of the blood that are on the Kohen's finger. So in the blood would have taught that the entire amount needed for sprinkling must be received in one single vessel simultaneously. But I would still not know that the Kohen's finger must obtain the blood through being dipped. Perhaps wiping is also valid. And this is Misayeh Leila Rabbi Lazar. With this we'll conclude for today. The Yomi Rabbi Lazar Shirayim Sheba Etzba Psulim. Okay, this is where we'll stop for today. And we're slowly catching up. Okay, have a great day.